Us physical game collectors have a lot of things in common. We obsess over pieces of plastic on our shelves and spend absurd amounts of money on games we'll likely never finish. But the attribute we all share more than anything is that we really love complaining about absolutely unimportant and unnecessary issues. One such complaint of mine is video game spines. The side of the box you see displayed most often, allowing you to quickly identify what games you are grabbing from the bunch. It seems like it should be pretty simple, right? You have a game logo and a console logo, just throw it on the side and call it a day. But for some reason, these companies always seem to find a way to make this as convoluted as possible. So let's talk about some of my personal least favorite video game spines and figure out what goes into making a good one. The most famous troublesome video game spines are of course the discount best sellers editions. Player's Choice, Greatest Hits, Nintendo Selects, Platinum Hits, or whatever other nonsense these companies are able to come up with. This practice began back on Nintendo platforms with the Player's Choice line. On both Super Nintendo and Game Boy, a game that had sold 1 million copies was granted the Player's Choice stamp of approval on their box art and was given a hefty discount. Their new competitor PlayStation had a slightly different plan though. As the newcomer to the console market, Sony needed to make some splashes to get attention, and so they introduced the Greatest Hits line, which was essentially no different than Player's Choice. However, their stipulations for who could join the club were much more lenient. On PS1, a game only needed to sell 150,000 copies and be on the market for a year to be given the Greatest Hits blessing. It's worth noting that not only was this a great deal, it also allowed some games to receive significant updates since the discs were being reprinted. The same could be said for Nintendo's Player Choice games, but the updates were usually more marginal. Some of the PS1 examples, however, were actually super meaningful, such as Spyro Year of the Dragon, with the infamous Speedway glitch that could ruin your save data being patched out. This makes the Greatest Hits version of that game the definitive way to play it on original hardware. In a time when the digital updates we have today were not yet possible, Greatest Hits allowed developers to have that second chance and gave gamers the potential best version of the greatest games available for cheaper than ever. So how then could that possibly be a problem? Well, unfortunately, Sony chose the most god-awful green and red spine to represent the Greatest Hits line. And so just like that, what had historically been a huge win had just become a gamer's worst nightmare. Or I guess I should say a collector's worst nightmare. Because with this differently colored label, the uniformity of your shelf was done for. And with Sony's more lackadaisical approach of who could qualify for Greatest Hits, there were a lot of them. Now, I don't want to over-exaggerate the problem here because let's be honest, most normal people probably didn't even care in the slightest. I mean, a lot of gamers of the time would just throw their discs in CD holders and toss the box anyway. They were probably thrilled to get these games for so cheap and barely even noticed. It's really those of us trying to collect later who made these such a big issue, since we're getting all the negatives of a worse-looking spine without the benefit of a cheaper game. That's why, despite all the whining you'll hear today, these initiatives were super successful, and that's also why they continued on for so many more generations. Unfortunately though, throughout most of these new console eras, they never seem to figure out the spine issue. Obviously, I do understand why they would do this. The color difference is meant to differentiate it easily in a game store. It grabs your attention and makes it look special. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it just sucks to have your collection broken up like this. And Nintendo showed you don't always have to alter the spine in major ways to get your point across. For those consoles, the Player's Choice branding was dropped in favor of Nintendo Selects. It was the same concept, older games being reprinted and sold for cheaper, but this time, they didn't change the spine all that much. Instead of a major color alteration, they just added a nice little crown icon at the bottom. Sure, that is still a difference, but it's not nearly as noticeable. And since several Wii games had company logos or little characters at the bottom of the spine anyway, it kind of just blends in on the shelf and isn't much of a distraction at all. The biggest irony of this, though, is that right when they seemed to figure it out, discount lines stopped altogether. They just don't do these anymore, with the trend coming to a screeching halt on Switch, PS5, and Series X, which is great for the collection shelves, but it does suck knowing great discounts are no longer coming. I imagine this change occurred primarily because games get so frequently updated now that the idea of a game being past its prime and no longer desirable enough to purchase is not always a thing. With that in mind, maybe we were a little too hard on these things. Yes, they are a blight on the shelf, but if a yellow spine was what it took to not pay full price for a Nintendo game 5 years after launch, maybe that was a price worth paying. And so even though I just ranted about them, it's hard for me to be too upset about these spines, because at least they came alongside legitimate marketing rationale and a tangible benefit to those buying them at the time. The kinds of spines that really grind my gears are the ones that completely throw off your collection for absolutely no good reason. Two consoles come to mind for me when I think about collection aesthetics getting thrown off. The first is the 3DS, which saw Nintendo make a big change in 2017, around 5 years into the console's life. Up until that point, all Nintendo published games had this nice little gray Nintendo logo at the bottom. And oh man, do I love these 3DS boxes. They almost always had unique, colorful game logos, and I really enjoyed that they included the icon that would appear on the home screen when putting the game into your system on the spine. I truly had no complaints, but around 2017, to coincide with the launch of the Switch, Nintendo updated their logo. The new logo is this red square with white lettering, and yes, Nintendo does consider the red outline as part of the official logo. It's not just a box put there to help it stand out from a white background, that is the full logo. They decided to update this logo onto new 3DS games since the portable was still receiving some first-party support at the time, which left us with this absolute monstrosity. I almost can't put into words how much I despise this. First of all, it just straight up looks bad. On a Switch spine, the red outline logo is fine because the entire thing is red, but on a white 3DS spine, it stands out like crazy and appears as if it was slapped on there without a second thought. I also feel like it makes the whole spine look way more cramped, which is not ideal since 3DS boxes are already quite small. But without a doubt, the part that makes me laugh the most is that they also switched the direction the logo is facing, because apparently, arbitrarily changing the logo you've been putting on an entire console's library wasn't enough. They also really needed to flip it from horizontal to vertical just to add that extra little spice of annoyance. Speaking of consoles changing things as the generation goes on, what the hell is going on with Xbox cases? Sometimes it says Xbox One, sometimes it just says Xbox. Sometimes there's a space in the spine before the console logo, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the coloring of the green border or the line under the Series X logo randomly changes as well. Then they moved to a different template entirely in 2021 with a small border that only goes across half the box, but it didn't give some games the memo, I guess. I mean, I swear to you, every single time I look at an Xbox game case, something about it is just a little bit different. And I don't even understand how that's possible. Is it not significantly easier to just have one baseline that everyone uses? How are you in a position where every game is seemingly just deciding for itself at random? I guess I'm not too surprised though. This is the company that named their console lineage Xbox, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Xbox One S, Xbox One X, Xbox Series S, and Xbox Series X after all. Maybe anticipating anything less than complete and utter nonsense from their spines was expecting way too much out of them. It's a good thing their competitor Sony used such a simple number-based naming structure for their consoles. Surely then nothing could go wrong with their spines. Well, actually, part of what really inspired this video was when I was looking at my shelf of PlayStation 5 games and noticed a trend that I really hate. And that is these spines with the super basic fonts and nothing else going on. Capcom and Sega seem particularly fond of these, with several of my examples coming from those two publishers alone. This just looks so dull and boring. And I can't for the life of me figure out why you would opt for this when you could just as easily place the regular logo on there, or hell, at least use a font that is representative of the game itself. I know physical games aren't as popular as they used to be, but damn, we're really just gonna go with the first default font that pops up when you start typing? What's even weirder is that sometimes these same publishers decide not to do this. Why did Pragmata get to have its logo on the spine, but Resident Evil Requiem didn't? Both of these games games came from Capcom and were released just months apart. But nothing, and I mean nothing, is worse than what Bandai Namco did with the Pac-Man World Repack series. Pac-Man World 1, nice logo on a clean black background. Pac-Man World 2, completely empty white spine with the default font text. Awesome stuff, guys. This looks great right next to each other. I think what I've realized from this default font dilemma is that I really don't like super simplistic spines. I like when they have a little character to them, which is why it sure would suck if there was a console where every single spine had no character whatsoever. Ah, the Switch spines. This is probably going to be my most controversial opinion I have in this video, as I know tons of people love their uniformity, and I do recognize the irony of my next statement since I literally just ranted about greatest hits ruining the uniformity of shelves, but I feel like Switch spines take things a little too far. I'm all for a baseline level of similarity, such as logo placements or design choices, but I gotta be honest, my eyes just glaze over when I look at my Switch collection. Every single spine is exactly the same, with the game title displayed in an identical basic white font. I think my main problem is that the spines are so thin and the text is so small that it's hard to make out what any game on the shelf actually is. Sometimes I'll see people post about their Switch collection with like 2,000 games in it, and the picture just looks like a giant wall of red to me. I can't decipher any individual game or focus my eyes on anything interesting. It's just like, yeah, that's a lot of red. I was really happy when they went back to the more colorful spines for Switch 2, although it's a shame so many of the covers are ruined by the Declaration of Independence explaining what a Switch 2 edition is. If someone told me Switch spines are their absolute favorite, I would actually understand where they're coming from, but for me personally, it's a miss. With that said though, absolutely, 100% give me these boring-ass red spines over whatever Sony did with PlayStation 3. We talked earlier about how Nintendo changed their logo on 3DS spines a few years in, which was a little bit frustrating. But now imagine if a company changed their logo 3 different times in a single console lifecycle. This, folks, is the absurd history of PlayStation 3 spines. At launch, you had this little red square that said PS3. This was always strange to me, as throughout PS2 and PSP, Sony had pretty firmly solidified red meant greatest hits, but now red just meant nothing, I guess. On the flip side, the front of the box featured the notorious Spider-Man font PlayStation 3 logo. Yes, Sony did indeed use the exact same font for their console as the Raimi Spider-Man films. You might think this is some sort of coincidence, but no, it's literally the same. If you don't believe me, just take a look at the hilarious sight of the Spider-Man 3 video game on PlayStation 3. Now, why would they do this? Because the then CEO of Sony, Ken Kutaragi, thought the font was so cool, he insisted on using it. I'm not kidding, by the way. That was their only reasoning. He just liked the font. But eventually they thought to themselves, you know what? Maybe it's not such a good thing that our logo makes everybody think of a superhero movie instead of the actual product we're trying to sell. Additionally, the PS3 was undergoing major changes following its disastrous launch, and a new logo could help usher in that new era for consumers. And so, in 2009, alongside the launch of the PS3 Slim model, Sony introduced the new PS3 logo and spines, which in my opinion are both significantly better. While we've established I'm not a fan of spines changing halfway through a generation, I completely understand why Sony felt the need to do this, and I'm willing to live with it. But then, oh then, they decided to change the spine a third time. In early 2014, Sony introduced a blue spine variant that was meant to fall in line with the PS4 and Vita. Now, before I get too ahead of myself, this was a super obscure version. It was primarily only found in North America and was only used for like 12 games. You could easily buy nearly the entire PS3 catalog and never even realize this was a thing, but that doesn't make it any less absurd, because the entire idea is nonsense from the very beginning. Why would you want your last generation games to look more similar to the ones released on your new console? Isn't the whole point to differentiate them and easily represent the fact that they are not the same thing? Especially since the PS4 was not backwards compatible, so if you bought this thinking it was a PS4 game, you were screwed. As you may imagine, this nonsensical decision didn't last very long, but that doesn't stop the fact that North American PS3 collectors now need to look at 3 different spine variations. And that's before we've even mentioned greatest hits or this little square denoting if the game has PS Move support. So let's make that 5 different potential spines for a single console. PlayStation literally just killed physical video games, and this is still the most offensive thing they've ever done to game collectors. So as much as I do love PS3 and its catalog, I also can't deny it represents every single thing that annoys me about video game spines. While video game spines could be seen as a very trivial issue to complain about, at the same time it kind of isn't. Some of these games have been on my shelf, displayed spine first, for literally 10 to 15 years at this point. I've spent a lot of time walking past these things and looking at them, so it's not that crazy to say I want them to look decent. Plus, going through all the spines I dislike has helped me realize what it is I do enjoy. I want a minimum level of uniformity, a set of rules that allows some semblance of reason to be present. I don't want you switching things up every few years or whenever you feel like it. But that doesn't mean I need every single spine to be exactly the same. I still want personality, color, or style representative of the game within the box. At the end of the day, that's what these things are for, right? Displaying on a shelf or grabbing attention in a store. So I think it's pretty reasonable to care about how they look, but I've done enough rambling for one day. What are your favorite and least favorite video game spines? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.